Well, welcome to another episode of The Extraordinary Life with Jean Rule. I'm here with my guest, Crystal Green, my new friend, actually. We'll talk a little bit about how we came to meet in a minute. But welcome, Crystal. Thank you for taking the time to be on my program. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we met in what I would consider the most unique way. I think if I could project the future, I'd say we're going to be lifelong friends. But we started out back late January, early February, before all this crazy COVID thing happened. We met at one of my open houses. I was helping my friend market some townhomes in Seattle, and you and your family walked in, your lovely husband and two children, and I think you just saw a sign, and you were here in town for a basketball event or something like that.
He had a tournament in Tacoma, late January or February, like you said. So we come out for that. And we love Seattle. We visited for the first time maybe 3 years ago. And just right off from there, we just knew that at some point we'd find our lives there. So I think we were looking for open houses. And then we just came across the sign for the one you were doing randomly. So yeah.
Well, it was fun meeting your family and your kids. It doesn't hurt that your names are easy to remember when you're meeting a stranger for the first time. It's always a good thing. It's like, thank God. And then COVID hit, and so here you are down in LA, and I'm up in Seattle, and I knew that there was something there because I would send you a card or an email or something, and you'd actually respond. A lot of people I meet in my field can't be bothered or are busy or don't see that connection. But now that we've gone down the path a little bit, I can understand why. I think our adopting my grandnephew probably hit a chord with you, which I'm sure we'll explore in a little bit. I appreciate the connection that you extended to me. It didn't just go on deaf ears. I started to get curious about you. I know you had said that you were down in LA and that you were doing some writing and some producing and acting. So as we were exchanging texts and cards, it made me realize, hey, I want to get to know Crystal a little bit better. So I searched you out on the internet, kind of ghosted you, and found a few things that you had produced, which were cool and fun, but also that you wrote a memoir in 2018. As any good real estate agent, I'm like, well, I'm going to read her memoir because then I'll get to know you a little bit better. So I know what I can be looking for in terms of housing and neighborhoods for you. And what I discovered, I really was not expecting at all. And that is really the story of your life. And before I turn it over to you, where we begin talking about the story of your life, here I am doing this podcast. It's a new venue for me. Usually I'm at home doing some home improvements, and I've decided to stop doing some of that physical work myself and invest in people's lives. And that's kind of where this podcast birthed out of. And of course, my number one go-to person to start that is my good friend, Nicole Etuck. And we had just gotten done interviewing her story, and I was in the process of editing it. And if any of our listeners are familiar, hopefully you listen to that interview with her first, because that is going to set the stage for Crystal's journey. Well, why don't we turn it over to you, Crystal? Can you just tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like, what your circumstances were taking place as you were entering this world?
Yeah, it was, my childhood was rough. I'll say that. To kind of give some history, though, I was born in Michigan. I was actually born while my mother was incarcerated. And so my mother, gosh, I've got to go way back. My mom, while she was in high school, my grandfather, who was this gambling addict, had gotten into an altercation with a younger man while gambling. And my grandfather ultimately killed him. And as a result of that family sought revenge against my grandfather, who was at this point in prison. And so they came after my family. And the way the story was always told to me is that these people who did this, who sought this revenge, they went to my mother's school and they claimed that my grandmother, which was her mother, was hospitalized and they were taking my mother out for some reason. I don't know. And I'm assuming way back then, the rules and because now you can't just walk into a school and take a child out, but things were different back then. But they went in, took her out, and from there things escalated. They drove her out to this road in our hometown and they shot her up with a bunch of drugs and pretty much left her to die. And the way it was told to me is that a neighbor or someone that my grandmother knew found her. She had somehow escaped the vehicle that she was in when they stopped to go to a gas station. And so, from what my aunts and my uncles always say, they couldn't afford rehab back then, so she was kind of left to her own devices, I guess. My grandmother, I'm assuming, had no idea what to do with this situation because here she is, this mom of seven, and she has this child who's now an addict through no fault of her own, and just trying to navigate that. And from whatever age this happened until my mom ultimately became pregnant with me, what I was told, she was arrested and then she was put in jail. And at that point, she found out she was pregnant with me. So it certainly wasn't planned. From what I've learned, she wasn't in a relationship with my father. He was, as we say, in the streets, just like she was. It was
Mhm.
kind of just a lifestyle inconvenience, I guess, that she got pregnant. But either way, she ended up in jail, and of course, she couldn't keep me. As the story was always told to me, when I was 4 days old, the option my mother had was to I would be sent into foster care or I would have to go with a relative. And so my grandmother and my aunt came to this hospital or wherever I was at, and they took me home. And for a number of years, my grandmother was my legal guardian.
Mm.
And since the time I wrote the book, there's all sorts of things I'm sure I'll share with you that I've learned.
Sure.
Um, but I went to live with my grandmother. By this point, all of her children were adults, so it was just the two of us for until my sister was born, which was 14 years later. And I think between 12 and 14 is when my grandmother adopted me.
Mm.
And I remember in our living room, she was prepping me for what to say, and I didn't know any better. I just, was just kind of going with the flow, but she was prepping me for what to say. My mom showed up and what to say to the judge and all of that. So, yeah, and my mother didn't show. She didn't show for the hearing.
Mm.
Now, looking back, I can certainly understand why. Yeah, my grandmother was very tough, kind of like, having the best legal representation in the state or in the world, and then having to go up against that when you have nothing was the way I would describe it. If you line up my grandmother versus my mother, there's no way coming from what my mother was coming from that she was going to be able to take care of me. And I think she knew that. And she didn't have a case to really argue in court.
Mm.
So I went on, nothing really changed for me. I grew up in a very strict household. I didn't really have much interaction with the rest of my family because my grandmother didn't really trust anyone. My mother was on drugs through no fault of her own, but there was another aunt that I had, my mother's sister, who was also struggling with drugs and alcohol. It wasn't the same situation. She was actively in the streets and living her life and experimenting. So my grandmother was dealing with that. And then there's a totally different case, but my grandmother, I think, kind of treated them the same. So, yeah, that's, I guess, my beginning.
Mm.
And yeah, I didn't really know my family, and I grew up believing that my family had this jealousy of me because that's the picture that my grandmother painted, I guess, to kind of isolate me or keep me away from them, just saying they didn't like me and that kind of thing. And my grandmother was just a very mean and bitter woman, and so quick to tell me that I was taking her life away from her by being there. And I always felt that however she felt about my mother and her situation, she took it out on me. At least that's how it felt. Always angry, always yelling, always accusing me of using drugs and being promiscuous and just things that I think no child should have to go through.
Mm.
So she was very much verbally and emotionally abusive. And on rare occasions, she'd be physically abusive as well. But just more of just her rage and her emotions coming through and just the things that she said to me and the way that she set my life up, I guess. So, yeah, that's pretty much how my childhood went. And
Mhm.
by the time I was a teenager, I couldn't wait to get out of there. And I remember when I graduated from high school, before I graduated, I only applied for one college. Like that was it. I didn't send out a bunch of applications because I needed to get out. I knew that my grandmother was not going to pay for any application fees at all. Wherever I applied, that was going to come out of my pocket. And I was working a part time job, of course, but I mean, I'm a teenager. How much was I really making? So I applied, and fortunately, I got in so I could get away. And things were a little rocky because I was a dependent for financial aid and all of that. And so for a number of years, we struggled through that. But I would say that's where my life really began.
So, looking at your childhood up until that point of leaving the home, did you have people in your life that were teachers or friends or neighbors aware of your situation and able to speak into your life and add some normalcy? One of the things that I really hope to accomplish with this podcast as I go about interviewing over 100 of my friends who are really very stable people. I want to encourage them as well as other listeners to be able to be on the lookout. It's like, how can we help? How can we make a difference in people's lives, like a Crystal or like a Nicole or like some of these other ones that we're in the process of interviewing, especially in this adoption series? Did you have people that you can look to, teachers or such, that helped you get over the hump? Because it sounds like it was really difficult and sad.
There was one woman in particular. She was from our church. And I'd say she was aware of my situation to a certain extent, as much as I felt safe revealing to her. But my grandmother, for whatever reason, trusted her. And I don't know if it was because she was at the church. She was very active in our church. And for whatever reason, my grandmother didn't doubt her. So she was the only person that was really allowed to pick me up from the house or maybe take me out for lunch or something every now and then. So I had her. I don't have any teachers that were aware of my situation. I think school for me in the early years were it was a very awkward situation for me. I didn't have many friends. I mean, I had a best friend in elementary school, but I knew through my interaction with her and any other friends that I had that my life was very different from their lives. It was just very different. So there was always some distance there. There was never anyone that I could get really close to and felt really comfortable revealing what was going on in my home. And then I did, as I got older, I had older cousins that, because even though my grandmother kept me pretty much to herself, I still knew who my family was. We lived in a very small town. It's not like I never saw them. But as I got older, I got to spend, and my older cousins started having children, I got to spend more time. Just at times they have a birthday party, I may be allowed to go there. But with my relatives, I think everyone knew without me having to really explain or say anything because after all of my aunts and uncles had grown up with this same person. And even though it felt that her bitter and her resentment or her anger was geared toward me, my grandmother had this entire life that she lived prior to my existence that made her the way that she was. And I think that my presence in her life maybe just escalated that or intensified her emotions. My aunts and uncles, and even to this day, they'll definitely brush things off. That's just how mom is, that kind of thing. So even though I was experiencing this for the most part, people didn't really know. Once my grandmother brought me home, she was still working full time. She had set up this babysitting situation. There was a older couple. They had an in-home daycare. And so a lot of my time that wasn't spent with my grandmother was spent there. The husband, he'd take me to school every day. For a number of years, my grandmother would basically get me ready for school, get me cleaned up and all that, get my hair styled. And then she would drop me off at this babysitter's house. And a lot of nights I spent at their house. And then I'd wake up and I'd have breakfast and everything there. And then he'd drive me to school. After school, my grandmother would pick me up. So I spent a good deal of my time there as well when I wasn't with my grandmother. And that got kind of tricky as well because I referred to them as my godparents, but I didn't have another name for them. They were more than just babysitters because we were very close. I was the youngest child they'd had in the home. I came there when I was just a few days old. So we did have a bond. And I struggle with that a little bit as I've gotten older, and I can look back and really take in what I was exposed to because it was a very hostile environment. Even there, the husband was physically abusive to the wife, and it was seems like it was every day. Every day before I went to school, he'd punch her or hit her in the face or something during breakfast, or it was that kind of thing. And he was an alcoholic as well. But living in the dysfunction, it just felt normal. It felt like that was just my life. But as I got older, I just realized that this is definitely not right. And I think the most painful discovery was that my grandmother was aware. She was fully aware of this domestic violence. And then the woman, the primary sitter or caretaker for that, there were other children. There was definitely a lot of physical abuse toward them as well. And I think that it was awkward because I didn't get that. I witnessed the abuse and I was exposed to it for sure, but I was never on the receiving end of it. And I think that, again, just being the baby in that home during that time kind of preserved it. And they didn't get this child who had come from this home and had a long history. I was a baby. I got to kind of grow up with them. And they were aware of my situation as much as there was only so much that I could explain to them at a young age. But as I got older and I maintained a relationship with them, I would tell them. But I think they were just from a different time. And so it wasn't they were about 10 or 11 years older than my grandmother. They didn't understand it the same way. It wasn't that bad in their minds, I guess.
Well, the reality that my first interview with my friend Nicole Etuck, for those that listened to it, a little bit of a quick recap, or for those that haven't heard it, this will be new information. But I was 23 years old and I volunteered at a county jail in New York. And I met a mom who was incarcerated and pregnant. And her and I became friends. She pled, I believe, guilty and ended up serving 5 to 7 years in a state prison in New York State. But she trusted me to handpick a couple that took her child to raise her while she was in prison. And so when I hear your story, and then for those that listened or those that hopefully will listen, Nicole's story is so different than yours. She was able to be placed with some friends of mine that raised her in a very loving home that really wanted for nothing. For the most part, she lived a pretty charmed childhood. And it just speaks volumes. I think even more so meeting you and hearing your story, the power of volunteering, the power of the experience of being able to intervene and be in someone's life and come up alongside them to help navigate a really difficult situation. And I don't know if we waved a magic wand and I were there in that jail where your mom got arrested, whether or not the same thing would have happened. Obviously, everybody's different, and you have a story to tell that's different than Nicole's. But the fact remains that power of being able to come alongside someone that's in crisis, that you never know what is going to be that journey. It's a risk on my part to come up alongside somebody that has some trauma in their life or comes from a violent background. But it's powerful. The power of being able to intervene in someone's life is really amazing and just speaks to me through your story. Let's move on from there and see what your adult life was like. I mean, here you started out with almost like you went from the frying pan into the fire from your mom and then your grandmother and then the babysitter. And now you're able to go off to college. Tell us a little bit about those years and meeting your husband and then ending up moving to Georgia, I believe, and then on to LA.
Yeah. So I actually met my husband when I was 14. I was members of his grandfather's church. So we met for a few months. That was my boyfriend back in that time. And then we broke up, of course, and life went on. And we reconnected when I was 17. But going into college, I mean, like I said earlier, it was rough because I was so dependent on my grandmother, at least for her financial aid purposes. Of course, I knew that if I was going to do this, it would be on me, but the law said I was her child, so I still had to use her information for those documents. And that was a struggle because my grandmother was a very paranoid person, and she thought that by me needing her social security number for that I was trying to do something to her or destroy her credit. And it went on every single year. It was ridiculous, because I was just trying to go to school and I didn't want to have to use that. That made it challenging. At this point, I was dating husband, my boyfriend at the time. He was in college and in our hometown, and he's like, I'm going to move. And so at first I thought, okay, I don't know if I can do that or whatever, if I should. I didn't want it to be like I was just going behind him. I didn't really have my own identity anyway, just kind of figuring it out. But I took a risk. And after about a year and a semester, I took off. I loaded up my little car and I hit the road and I drove to Georgia. And he'd moved out there maybe a few months earlier. And so that December, I drove from Michigan to Georgia, and that was the longest that I'd ever driven on the highway. I ended up going to get a job, and I was going to just transfer or go to another school, and it didn't quite happen that way. So I got there, and I had this job lined up at a gym, and I got hired, and I worked for a while, and I was going to a college, and then I hit a financial aid issue that even having my grandmother's information didn't get me out of. So I couldn't go to that college. I found an apartment in the same city and I applied, and for some reason I had excellent credit, so I got approved. And I moved in and I thought, okay, this is good. I just need to figure out college. And so after a few months, they fired me. They got rid of me at that job, and I ended up having to leave my apartment, and I moved in with my boyfriend, which at the time I did not want. I wanted to be this independent young woman who could hold down her own, but I didn't have any money, so I had to go somewhere. Ended up enrolling in another college. I graduated. I made it to the end. And I looked and I'm like, okay, I have enough credits for this. I'm gonna go in this field. And I really had no intention of doing anything in the field of sociology, but I needed to get out of there and move on with my life. So that's how that happened. But before that, I had majored in theater. I had majored briefly in media and music production and fashion design. And before that, at the other university, I'd majored in English. I've always been a writer. So I really had no idea. I'm sure I'm not alone in that and not knowing what I'm doing in college. But ultimately, I just decided on sociology and left with that. But yeah,
Yeah, my husband, he wanted to be a symphonic trumpeter. That's how he started out his college career, ended up a college president. I started out wanting to be a potter. I was kind of following in my dad's footsteps, who was an industrial designer and loved art and creating things. And so that's how I started out. And I ended up being a bunch of different things. I will say that I've used my art degree the most, I think, out of all these years, right? The thing that I didn't really think I would put to use at all ended up being a lifelong passion. There's so many different avenues to go when you're a creator, when you work that muscle. So okay, so you got your college degree in hand, I think, or close to it, and you set off to conquer the world.
yeah. I think even though I had this degree, there was still this going back to my childhood. One thing that I wanted to pursue, but my confidence was so low that I didn't really, even though I wanted to, and I felt like, okay, I can do this. I didn't have the a strong enough vision, and I certainly didn't have the support at home. But I wanted to act. I remember I used to watch the Jackson Five movie. It was like hours long. But I just remember watching that, and afterwards, I'd always go in the mirror and kind of act it out on my own. And so I held on to that. I was creative. I was always a writer. In middle school, I was in a play. In church, I did a play here and there. But I felt that I wanted to do that kind of work because it took me away and I didn't have to go through what I was going through for that time. I could get away and be somebody else. So I had an interest in that. I had never, as far as my community or where I'd come from, I'd never seen that. I've never seen anyone come from where I came from and do that. It was kind of hard for me to really have a strong enough vision to see it through. At least that's how it felt. So that's why in college I kind of dipped in and out. I was majoring in theater, then I got out. I just wasn't really sure how to do it.
Well, I have to share that my mom, she grew up in Michigan as well,
Mhm.
in the Detroit area, and she wanted to be an actress. That was like her passion in life. And she recently passed away at almost age 94. So this would have been in the late 40s. That was her dream. And so she started in Catholic theater before television. It was
Mhm.
kind of radio. And she was kind of good at it. She kept some little keepsake articles about her being in this play or that play. And so instead of being able to pursue that dream, she got married and had 10 kids. And I'm the ninth child of 10. And her marriage was kind of rocky as well. My mom and dad divorced after about 24 years of marriage, which is actually how long Dave and I have been married. So it would be at this point that they had 10 kids and divorced. And so it was not a great marriage, not a great time for her to have had this dream and then to go into a different direction. But then when I was a teenager, she went back into the theater. We lived in New York at that time, about 90 miles north of New York City. So you got to figure the theater group that she was in, it had some off Broadway actors in it. And so at first, people in the acting guild there didn't quite take her too seriously. She was like in her mid 50s, about my age now. And she showed up and she's like, okay, I'm here. I'm going to save the day. And they're like, yeah, yeah, right. So they gave her a couple of bit parts and they tried to be nice to her. And she would bring me along because I kind of like you, I was bored and beginning my troubled years and didn't have a lot going on. So maybe it was her way of keeping tabs on me, or
Yeah.
out of boredom, I didn't have anything to do, so I just tagged along and hung out with all these older actor wannabes. And but within a short period of time, like within a year or two, she was commanding leading roles and winning Best Actress awards.
Wow.
She was just that type of person that what you saw first impression was not what you ended up getting with her. And her greatest achievement was the Belle of Amherst, which is a one woman, 2 hour production of the life and poetry of Emily Dickinson. And
Okay.
our living room became like Emily's set, filled with antique furniture because she lived in Massachusetts during the 1800s. And so, yes, she became Emily Dickinson, and she toured around the state of New York, mostly in New England, putting on that play, and won the Best Actress award for it in New York State. I think it was 1978. And she was so funny because practically on her deathbed, when I saw her back in the fall, we all flew to Florida. Eight of her children were around her bedside. You know, back in the day where you could actually go in and be with
Yeah,
your loved
yeah,
ones in a hospice setting where they're dying.
yeah,
And yeah, it's weird the world we're living in now, but yeah, so we were able to do that, and she's like, "Gene, I want you to have my trophies." Like that was her prized possession that she was leaving to me was her acting trophies, and so I know that that was a very special time for her. I never craved the limelight. I was
yeah.
like the stagehand. I was the backstage person constructing the sets and doing the concession stand and all that. Just doing this podcast is way going out of my comfort zone, but I I just feel these stories are just too good to pass up. I just think I have the most amazing friends and want to share. So, anyway, let's get back to your story, Crystal. So, I think at this point, we're transitioning from moving from Georgia back to Michigan, where you had a few of your children, right? Can you talk about what becoming a mom and what that experience was like?
Yeah. Well, actually, I ended up staying in Georgia for about 6.5 years. I got pregnant in 2009 with my first child. I actually got pregnant somewhere between, I don't know, we were supposed to get married that October. And I found out I was pregnant during that time. But so we ended up getting married. 2009, I had my son was born in 2010, and he was born prematurely. I was 6.5 months pregnant. Certainly didn't expect him, and I went into labor. And he was born, and we spent the next almost 2 months in a NICU in Georgia, and he ultimately passed away. And from there, we were already struggling financially. This was during the time of when everyone was struggling to get back on their feet after 2008 and that recession, and we were caught up in that. So we had already, while he was in the NICU, we, believing that he'd come home, we had started looking at jobs, potential job opportunities in Michigan, because we knew that that's where my husband's family, I mean, my family, but we just weren't close. But my mother-in-law was there, and we knew that coming out of the NICU with this baby, we were going to need some help. So we were planning on going back home for a while, just for a little while before we took off and went wherever we wanted to be. During this time, I had applied for a job with the state of Michigan to work in child protective services. Listen, and I think it would have been okay, but my son ended up passing away, so it made things very challenging for me because here I was. And yeah, we still had to move back to Michigan even without him because we were struggling so badly. But going into this, we moved to Michigan. We moved in with my mother-in-law for a while. And then I got the call that I got this job. And I was making good money. I had the benefits, and my husband ended up getting a job in Michigan, and things were okay. But just day in and day out, Gene, just going into these homes and investigating these allegations of abuse and neglect, and just seeing some parents seemingly taking their children for granted. And me having come out of this situation, with my son who had just passed away, it
Yeah,
was
I'm so
tough.
sorry. Yes.
It was tough. I had parents threatening my life and going in and out of court and having to remove children from their homes. It was just a very tough situation. And I remember I had been there almost a year. When I started working there, my very first case was this woman who had, I believe, 4 children at the time, and she had thick case file, had been in the system for a long time. And when I started, she had given birth to a daughter. And naturally, because she had an open investigation, I had to go out and investigate the birth of this baby and make sure her well being was good. And soon after, the baby passed away. It was just all too much, I think, just having to go into the morgue and view this baby's body and interview this distraught mom who ultimately threatened to take my life. It was a lot. And I remember the last time I went to court with this family, I came back to my job and I called my supervisor and I said, this is my 30-day notice. And I didn't even have a plan. This is it for me. And around the same time, my husband had an opportunity to transfer his job to another location in Michigan or to Los Angeles. And so we said, okay, here's a chance for us to really get out of here. And so we took the LA transfer. And of course, I'm sure you know this, the cost of living in Michigan is drastically less than LA. And we were doing good in Michigan. We had moved out of my mother-in-law's, had a nice apartment, had our vehicles. We were doing okay, starting to pay back student loans.
We had moved from New York to Michigan in 2005 as my husband got his first presidency. We were in Muskegon, and we had to move all the way to West Michigan to get a New England Colonial that we could afford.
Mm,
And then moving from Michigan to Portland in 2008 when the recession had hit, all we could afford was a foreclosure. I did do that home improvement on that home. I think I
yeah,
sent it to
I
you.
saw it. I
It
saw it.
came out pretty nice, I have to
It
say. Made
did.
$100,000, which made up for all that money that we lost on our house in Michigan that we had to sell. But anyway, yes, I know that real estate conundrum very well. You end
Yeah.
up in LA. We have to mention too that your husband is a basketball player. That's what you were doing when we met, playing just a tournament game or something up in Tacoma, as you said. It sounded like at some point he had a potential to make some money at it and forewent that because of the trauma of your son's death. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. While we were in the NICU with my son, at this point, he was still playing basketball at the time and he was in different tournaments all around. And he had an opportunity to play in a professional league internationally. And then our son was on his last breath, like he wasn't going to make it. And we knew that. And my husband made the choice to not take this opportunity because he didn't want to leave me alone, to have to deal with this because ultimately I would be able to go with him. But at first I'd be by myself and I'd be with his mother-in-law. And even though, I'm very grateful to have her, no one can really understand that the way that my husband could understand it. But he made that choice. And I mean, he still plays off and on now. He usually gets in a tournament or two every year, but he's kind of let go of possibility of that being a part of his future,
Mhm.
professionally. Yeah.
Well, and it just goes to show you, I mean, there's so many professional athletes. How many more are there that didn't make that dream come true because of some really profound sacrifices on their part? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I wanted to entitle this podcast The Extraordinary Life, because it's not my extraordinary life, although what's extraordinary about it is I know so many ordinary people that when you string all your lives together, it's pretty extraordinary. He's a great example of just an ordinary guy that's doing extraordinary things. So kudos to your husband there. So I've never lived in LA. I've visited a few times. You fly out of there often enough in different places that we're going, but what's that experience like? That's where you live right now, right?
I do. We've been here for almost 8 years. LA is everything you've seen on TV, the good and the bad. I'll say that. When we first moved here, we were coming from doing well financially in Michigan to, okay, you're not doing well in LA at all. Drastically different. But we did find an apartment that we could afford. And I ended up getting pregnant with my daughter. Even though the apartment was good, the neighborhood was questionable. So we wanted a better neighborhood, but we couldn't really afford a better neighborhood. So we ended up finding a place, a pretty large apartment that we would share with a friend that we met out here. That lasted for about a year. And then we moved to the place where we're at now. And my daughter's been here since she was 10 months old. But LA, even though it's true to what I'd seen or what I imagined it would be, I didn't love it at first in the way that I assumed I would because I wanted to be this actress. And naturally, I'm supposed to love LA, but I didn't feel that way. Even though I had spent time in Georgia, Georgia was still very slow in comparison. And Michigan was even slower than that. I was kind of like this small town girl who was still struggling very much to identify who she really was and just kind of in this big space.
And you were in your late 20s at the time?
Yeah, I was in my like mid to late 20s when I first moved here. And I had gone through, Gina, I had a list of maybe 50 different things that I wanted to do with my life. I went through these cycles where I'd beat myself up because I wasn't pursuing. I just kept going through these cycles of, hey, I want to be a personal trainer. And then I ended up getting the book. And then I'd say, okay, I'm not doing that. Then I wanted to do real estate for a while. And I ended up, when I was actually on bed rest with my daughter out here, and I started an online real estate course. And then I gave up on that. So I kept going in these cycles, where I'd pull from the list of things I wanted to do. And then I'd back out of it. And I could never get myself to complete anything. And that was always devastating because I just kept cycling and I wasn't going anywhere. And for a long time, I felt like that. And now looking back, I realized that I had a really rocky start. I try to cut myself some slack instead of always beating myself up because where was all of this energy going to come from if it started out so negatively for me to begin with? So I feel like I'm just teaching myself the ropes and just learning the best I can. Ultimately, that cycle kind of broke for me back in 2014. Up to this point, I had done like background acting. I did that a few times out here. I ended up working a job. Of course, I had my daughter, but I hadn't done anything that resembled anything that I thought I wanted to do with acting. But in 2014, I wrote my first web series when it was Young, Broke, and Married, which was the definition of my life. And we produced that. We did all the casting, and I think it was then that I realized, yeah, I want to act, but I want to do my own stuff. And that was a way I'd never used my writing in that way. Growing up, I would write poetry and things like that. I was always the one, in school. I may not have been that good with the multiple choice questions, but I knew if an essay question came, I had it. I knew that I could tell if we ever had to do storytelling in class, that was me. I own that. This was the first time I'd used my writing in such a creative way where I could come up with these characters and allow them to speak through me and
Mm.
tell these stories. And then it just felt incredible to be able to pull these strangers together and put them in these roles and do that. And that was a good start for me and leading to where I am now, realizing that hey, that's what I really want to do.
Well, it sounds like writing was an escape for you early on in your childhood, that you were able to process some of the trauma that you were experiencing by going in your room and writing in a journal, diary, or, school assignment or something like that, huh?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Especially with, with poetry or just writing, even if it was just writing a short story, I could escape. And even when I write now, even though my life isn't as traumatic, I mean, my kids run me crazy every day, but it's not it's not the same,
Mhm.
I can still I'm writing and I'm telling a story. Nothing else around me even matters. I'm telling this story and I'm totally just engaged and immersed into the lives of these characters.
Mhm.
It's that's my escape.
I tell the story in my interview with Nicole Etuck about reading becoming my escape as a teen, a troubled teen who was very bored, and how that was just a lifesaver for me. I think it helped me to get through those years, those high school years of being an early graduate. I graduated high school in 3 years rather than 4 years, having doubled up in my English and gym, I think were the two requirements that you needed to do 4 years of. Yeah, reading, writing are really critical, I think, in helping process trauma. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So you wrote you call it a web series, and then you wrote your memoir. What's next? What are you working on now? What do you hope the future holds?
Well, right now, I just finished writing, hopefully, the final draft of a feature. And so the goal pre-COVID, was to produce that this year. So we've kind of taken a pause, naturally, to see what happens with that. So that, I still hope to produce that in the near future. It's called Lock the Door, and it's a thriller about a mom who develops postpartum psychosis after the birth of her second child. I went through postpartum depression after the birth of my third child, my son. That story comes from my experience in a way, but and the beauty of storytelling is that I can tell the story that I want. So I made it bigger. I started the story years ago, and my first draft was years ago, but then I stopped. I couldn't complete it. And I started it, actually, let me track back, after the birth of my daughter. And it wasn't so much postpartum depression after the birth of my daughter, but more of, I've had this experience with losing my first child, and I'm an emotional wreck after the birth of my daughter, who seems to be perfect. The pregnancy was okay, with the exception of me having to go on bed rest, but she seems to be perfect. But I'm still struggling to process that.
Mm,
And so I started writing the story. But interestingly enough, I couldn't finish it until I had experienced postpartum depression.
mm.
And I finished telling the story, and then I told it again, and many drafts later, here we are. So yeah, so I'm working on that, and I have another series that I'm packaging and preparing to pitch. I just finished packaging an animated series as well, a children's series. So
Fun.
yeah, that's what I'm working on with that. I just launched a pescatarian recipe blog, Earth, Fin, and Fire, and I love music, so it's kind of a play on that. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. That and
Wow.
homeschooling my kids, and just trying to stay afloat with that. Yeah.
Well, the thing that impresses me the most with you, Crystal, I think, is not only just your creativity and your ability. I think the phrase would be like to claw your way out of a traumatic situation, right? You clawed your way out of trauma. You don't have an ounce of victim mentality in you, like, poor me. You seem to just have this, that was then. I can't change that. I'm going to try to learn from it. I'm still struggling with some of it. I'm sure being a parent, having a daughter, makes you go back in your mind to when you were being parented at that age, and poor modeling and such that doesn't go away. Some of that you just have to process as our kids get older. I see it with my own kids. When you don't have strong bonds, it's one of the things that we talk about so much in my interview with Nicole Etuck and some of our other interviews with my friends who are adopted, the importance of the bond between the mother and the child, and how we as a society, we, meaning my friends that are listening and those that are going to be listening to podcasts like this, how can we be inspired to do something and not just rely on, well, the government is dropping the ball, or the politicians are going to fix it or should fix it, or outrage that they're not fixing. Who's going to fix it? It's like, well, why can't we all take a piece of that? Because so much of fixing a broken system is us. We get changed, we get fixed. And so, hearing your story, one of the cool things that I've decided to do as we're kind of facing this graduation dilemma, all of these graduates, high school graduates, college graduates, they're not able to walk down that aisle and go up on that podium and have their name announced and all their family members cheer as they get their diplomas in hand. And it's really, especially heartbreaking for us, because my husband's an educator and spent 15 years as a college president, where he was the guy on the podium that had his doctorate cap and gown on, shaking the hands, and most of the time giving hugs to all these students
Mhm.
as they cross the stage. And so what we decided to join that national movement of adopt a graduate. So I went online to the national Facebook page and sorted through a couple of it's almost like a want ad, a classified ad of students that
Yeah.
are being either putting themselves out there. Hey, I'm this senior graduating this year. Will you please adopt me? But it's special. It's
Yeah.
using the word adopt. You really are creating this bond, this microcosm of a bond. And so I went on a couple, maybe 2 weeks or so ago, and picked this African American young lady from New Jersey, random stranger. I'm looking forward just in that beginning phase of connecting the two of us. She is so excited to go off to college. She kind of reminds me of you a little bit. And so I kind of in honor of you doing this interview and just being a part of my life now, I can't go back, obviously, and change anything in your past, but I can do something for it. I can pay it forward. And so I want to bless this 18-year-old girl that is so excited from New Jersey to go off to college. And hopefully, through sharing my life story with her, that maybe she'll listen to the podcast. I also want to encourage her if she could help me find another student, maybe an at risk student in her high school, maybe somebody that's marginalized that doesn't even have the wherewithal to post on that national Facebook page to be adopted. Maybe they just you can't even get to that stage. I'm going to ask her if she'll go on a mission for me to find another student that we can adopt and have her be a part of that story where she finds that person and helps me figure out what they would like or need and how we can impact their lives. I get,
Yeah,
I get very excited about things like that.
I love that. Yeah. And my sister graduated from college this year as well, but I had never even heard of that, adopt a graduate program.
Yeah.
But yeah, that sounds special.
This will be aired, well, hopefully the beginning of July. So I'm sure there's still some adopted graduates that won't be adopted by July 1st. If somebody hears this, they can
Yeah,
certainly go on Facebook and find a bunch. Some are grassroots in a particular state or community, and then others are just the national page. I decided to do the national page because I wanted to do somebody that completely across the country that was a perfect stranger. So I
yeah,
look forward to telling a story maybe in the future about me and this 18-year-old. She doesn't know what she's in for yet. You
yeah.
realize. So, Crystal, I have a few questions for you before we wrap it up. What advice would you give to the mother who is incarcerated right now and pregnant?
I would say don't give up on the possibility of still being in your child's life. I think now I've started recently to try to connect with my mother, like on an emotional level. It's kind of weird to explain, but I feel like because she was going up against my grandmother, it was kind of like she felt hopeless, like she couldn't, there was no way it was going to happen for her. But I would just tell that mother to just keep trying, don't give up. Just don't give up because even if you keep trying and it doesn't turn out in your favor, I think it's comforting for the child to at least know that you didn't give up on them. So I would say that just even if you feel defeated, just keep trying, keep looking for ways to connect.
Mm. How about to the child that's raised in a home where love is absent, kind of like your situation? What would you say to that child?
I would say that kind of the same, don't give up. I would also say that just imagine your future. The situation that you're going through, it's really just temporary. And even though it'll always affect you in some way, you don't have to remain this victim. You don't have to carry that around with you, and you can grow from it. You can overcome it. Just focus on what's ahead and what you want that to look like and stay true to that.
What would you say to the one who just lost a child?
Be easy on yourself and everything that you're feeling or experiencing it. You're not alone. I've come into contact with so many women who have lost, and for whatever reason, we just don't talk about it. And
Mm.
I think it would have been helpful for me when I was really in the heat of it to have those people that I could connect with, that I knew that I wasn't the only one going through this.
Mm.
So I would say just be easy on yourself and just take it day by day by day. Of course, it's been 10 years since we lost our son, but it doesn't mean that I'm over it. I
Mm.
still every day at some point, something that I do, or something with my other children, or something, there's a constant reminder that this person was, and he's affected our lives. But you just have to be easy on yourself and just take it one day, one moment at a time.
How about the one who has dreams? You have big dreams and you're making them happen. I'm so proud of you. What would you say to the one who feels like their dreams are just beyond their reach?
I would say understand that they aren't beyond your reach. If you can dream it, and I know it's probably cliche, but if you can dream it, it's very well possible. I don't think. I think we have so many thoughts just as humans, but I don't think thoughts come into your mind for no reason at all. I think if it's a thought, then that means it's a possibility, whether it's a good thought or a bad one, but just know that it's possible and just keep reaching. Even if you don't see what you're reaching for, just keep reaching and eventually you'll get there.
Cool. And how about last one? What would you say to the one who's struggling to be a loving parent because they themselves never had that luxury extended to them?
I experienced this as well, and I recognize it now. I think, earlier, a few days ago, when I was preparing for this to speak with you and just looking at what we may be discussing, I think it hit me at that point, maybe that, as much as I love my daughter, I think a lot of the struggles that I have with parenting her are a direct result of the way I grew up as this female child and not really knowing what love was supposed to look like. So I struggle. And I would just say, understand yourself. What helps me with my life is the more work I put into understanding myself and why I am the way that I am, why I make decisions. I have a place to grow from. So instead of just trying to hop on and tackle, okay, how can I love my child? How can I do this? I don't know. Instead of beating yourself up or trying to just hop on for the solution, dig deeper and figure out who you are and why things are the way they are. Because if you know what the issue is, then you know what you're growing from. So I would say that just the harder it gets, just get deeper into understanding yourself and maybe sit with yourself and yeah.
Yeah, I think our temptation sometimes is to like just do a Google search, like, okay, how do
With
I parent?
everything.
I know, but
Yeah.
you're right. It's really being more introspective that is the solution because no one has your unique story, and
Mhm.
oftentimes our path forward is by overcoming our past. Well, if you could go back in time to your younger self sitting there in the bedroom of your grandmother's home, what would you tell her today?
Good job. Good job. Because I think even if my life was very rocky throughout my childhood and into my adult life, the thing that sustained me is that I knew that that wasn't it for me. And so I would say, good job. You did the best that you could given the circumstances. Good job. And don't beat yourself up every day in the future. So, yeah, I would comfort her and let her know that she's right. That's not the end.
Mm. Well done. I think there's a lot of teen girls in that situation that contemplate suicide and some who go through with it because they just don't see the hope, the light at the end of the tunnel. And you're a great example that hanging in there and working through it and taking one day at a time and finding ways that you can express yourself, it does get better.
It does. When I've seen people that have grown up in a similar way or have similar experiences, and it doesn't always get better for them or hasn't always gotten better for them, but I think that we are in control of how our lives turn out for the most part. I think we play a big role in shaping how things go. And for me, it's taken a lot of really just putting in the work to heal through my traumas. understand myself and understand my situation. And I've grown to have this sympathy, I guess you'd say, for my grandmother, even. I've passed the point of being angry or feeling hurt by what she's done. And to be honest with you, in writing my book, a lot of things, a lot of memories surfaced because I had just forgotten. I think a lot of times when we go through things, or in my experience, what happens is even though you may start forgetting the small details, the result of what happened is still there. The pain is there, even if you don't remember what the specifics are. And so I was able to revisit and kind of relive a lot of those experiences that way. But understanding how my grandmother became who she was and how she got to that point has helped me just understand her as a person and ultimately have more of an understanding for myself and more sympathy for her. I don't know if that's weird, but yeah,
Yeah, well, the
yeah.
power of forgiveness is just that. It's
Hmm.
very powerful, and it can unlock your healing much more so than what it does for the person that you're
Absolutely.
forgiving, for sure. If we were to bury this interview in a time capsule and 10, 20 years from now you dig it up, what would you say to your future self or your kids or husband or family?
Well, first I tell my kids that, see, that's exactly what mommy was so hard on you about not giving up. I mean, if nothing else, I'm so tough on my kids with that. Even with schoolwork, just it's not even an option in our family to give up. So I think that's what I would say to them. That's what I would hope that they would find or get out of this interview. And my husband, I would definitely thank him. I think he's played a major part in my growth and helping me see who I am, even when I didn't see it for myself. So I would just thank him. If nothing else, I would just thank him and just thank him for always believing in me and for seeing the crystal that I didn't always see and for loving that and really showing me what love should look like or can look like. I think even with my grandmother, she struggled to show love. And I don't doubt that she believes that she was showing love in the way that she knew how, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I owe that insight, I guess, to my husband. My future self, I think I'd tell my future self, I'm glad you went through with this interview with Jean, even though you were nervous. But yeah,
Seem to be doing that to a lot of people
yeah,
lately.
but this interview came, or you just asking me, when I first wrote this book, I thought, and I wrote it down, probably manifested it. I'd like to get interviews. I'd like to be able to talk about this because I want this to reach people and not solely for the sake of making money off of this book, but I just want people to understand that what you're going through, everything's temporary, everything cycles. But if you can just hang in there for just a little while longer, you're going to be okay. And I just want people to, if nothing else, that's the message I want them to take away from my story. Just keep going. Things do get better.
Well, I'm excited because for those listeners who listened into Nicole Etuck's interview with me, we talk about Our Children, which is a nonprofit that comes up alongside this particular prison in New York. And they have a thriving ministry that reaches out to incarcerated moms and helping with that bonding process of their children. And they have an army of supporters and contributors, 6,000 on their mailing list. And they have committed to airing our podcast details and promoting it on their website or their email feed. And I would imagine out of those 6,000 people that click on our podcast, that maybe some of them will listen to your story as well. And you'll be able to reach an audience that you never fathomed was
Yeah.
possible all the way on the other side of the country. So that'll be exciting to hear any developments that come out of that. You
Yeah.
just never
Yeah.
know, right? These little connections, when you just don't let them just brush off, but you actually pursue them and work through the nerves, it's exciting to see what's going to come out of it. There was another mom that I met when I was looking at different ways we can bless that prison in terms of bonding with a mother child. They've hired a lactation consultant to help some of those moms bond with their child through
Mhm.
breastfeeding. So we have been in contact about them doing some grant giving potentially next year, as well as funding and giving some breast pumps to them. So we're excited about that. That's called the Perfect Push here in Redmond. I'll link it on the website. But how encouraging to hear about your journey. And I'm so excited about your book. I've read
Oh,
it twice
wow.
just so that I had a grasp on doing our interview here. I'll link it on the
Okay.
website, www.theextraordinarylifewithjeanrule.com. And so I hope our listeners will go to the website. They'll see some photos of you, link to your book. Maybe we can even link some of your productions that you've
Yeah.
done. That'd be fun. I'm sure people would love to see the stuff that you're doing and keep tabs on your progress. I'll update it over time. That'll be cool. And then I look forward to you moving up here so I can sell
Oh,
you
I
a house,
know.
first of all. And then, hopefully I'll be able to get you something that you're close by me. And then I can become
Yeah.
Aunt Jean or, somebody that can babysit
Yeah.
the kids so you and your husband can go out and enjoy a concert or something. And then your son is 5 and my son is 5. Who knows? Maybe they'll become friends. And Jace, our little guy, he has acting
Uh,
ability. So
yeah,
maybe
my
you
son's
can
a singer. He's 4. He'll be 5 in July. Yeah, maybe they'll click.
fun to anticipate all those
Yeah, for sure.
possibilities. Well, thank you, Crystal. Thank you for taking a leap of faith with me and being on my program. And I have high hopes for our future. Thank your husband for watching the kids there in the background while we went through our interview. And I look forward to
Okay,
talking to
same
you
here,
soon.
Jean. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
God
You too.
bless.